Okay, oh my gosh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much for coming.
We came for David.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you for coming for David. But while you're here, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the site and hope you come back. Andre Smith founded the site in 1937 as a winter artist retreat. So he built it as a place where artists could focus entirely on explorative art forms. He wanted them to try new things. We're currently the only National Historic Landmark in Central Florida, and to put that in context, that's the highest historical designation that a site can receive. It's the same designation as Lexington Battle Green, the USS Constitution, Hemingway House down in Key West. So it's the top designation, and the reason we have it is because of the beautiful architecture that you'll see if you explore our grounds this evening. It's called Mayan Revival. It was a subset of the Art Deco movement. It was never terribly popular. This is the most intact remaining example of it in the Southeast, one of the most intact in the nation. And our site differs from the rest of the Mayan Revival sites in that most of our art pieces are all hand-carved. We have over 2,000 hand-carved concrete art pieces that adorn the walls, and we consider that all a part of our art collection. So after the lecture this evening, I hope that you'll explore the site a little bit. We also have artists who still work on the site today. We have one of them here tonight, Audrey. Oh, two. Oh, great. Oh, and Jay as well. Thank you both for coming out. We also have 4 museums, including our art gallery, which is also open this evening to the public. And from its inception, this site was founded on equality. It was founded on inclusion, on community, and we also just found out it's founded on love. We found out 2 weeks ago there's a love story at the root of this site's founding that we're hoping to share with the public soon. And so it was always meant to be a place for all, and so I can think of no greater way to honor Andre Smith's spirit than having our talk this evening. So I'm excited to welcome David Matteson. He's going to be presenting The Pendulum of Pride, a history of LGBTQ resilience in Central Florida. David is a past board president of the LGBTQ History Museum of Central Florida, an organization founded in 2005 and dedicated to collecting, preserving, and exhibiting the region's queer history. David is also the Associate Curator in Education, Associate Curator of Education and Outreach at the Orlando Museum of Art, and a doctoral candidate in the Text and Technology program at the University of Central Florida. So you're incredibly busy. So thank you so much for joining us, and please give him a round of applause.
Well, thank you, Danny, and thank you to Hannah and Jesse, the Art and History Museum's Maitland, for having me. I am just so overwhelmed by the number of familiar faces here tonight. Thank you for being here. And I am going to be sharing this lecture, The Pendulum of Pride, and discussing our history, but a history, rather, of LGBTQ community in Central Florida. And just to get us started, I do want to share that the LGBTQ History Museum, a past board president and current board member, this museum is dedicated to collecting our LGBTQ history, preserving it, developing exhibitions. We primarily exist as a digital museum, so we have a website that you can visit, but we also have permanent exhibition space at the center, and we have monthly board meetings. It's a great way to volunteer. We are a grassroots volunteer-run organization. We have monthly board meetings where you can learn more about opportunities, and if you have interest in that, please see me after the lecture. So thank you. All right. I'm going to start off this evening with a bit of a note on methodology for how this lecture is organized. As Hitler and the Nazi Party ravaged his home country, the German philosopher Walter Benjamin grew frustrated with the weaponization of history. In his theses on the philosophy of history, he cautions against presenting the past as a progression that culminates in present-day society. He warned that this is yet another way for the ruling class to maintain power. Or, as the Orwellian adage goes, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Rather than embrace the spirit of progress, Benjamin argues the historian should act like the stargazer, who maps a constellation in the night sky. He must identify critical incidents throughout time to recognize patterns between past and present. Now, this approach presumes that history, never wholly accurate nor neutral, There's not a definitive record of the way things were. Instead, the historian interprets or understands that his point of view, his orientation to the stars above, always affects his interpretation of the past. It also rejects the belief that our society is inherently more liberated, more righteous, more just, more advanced than those that came before. So Benjamin's concept of history informs this lecture's organization and focus. And looking back at the development of Central Florida's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community, LGBTQ, I have searched for key moments from which we may draw a constellation, an image of the past informed by our current moment, our position in relation to the stars. When we look back, what do we see? What pattern might we identify? Benjamin's warning also makes me weary of beginning the story of gay liberation, of the gay liberation movement, with the oppression of queer identities and ending with a triumphal victory, an event that monolithically signals that we've made it, that those of us who identify as LGBTQ may now fully participate in all the pleasures and privileges that heteronormative society has to offer. Rah, rah, rainbows. Now, I agree with the statement that City of Orlando Commissioner Patty Sheehan made in her 2017 oral history, that change for this community is incremental. I also believe that the LGBTQ community embraces diverse possibilities for the meaning of change. We do not all envision the same utopia, and this vision propels our unique disruptions of the status quo, to make room for other pleasures, other freedoms, other ways of living and loving. So to respect Benjamin's call to be reflexive, I want to start by acknowledging my own location in this history. I identify as LGBTQ, but this does not mean that I am able to fully empathize with the experience of other members of this community, both past and present. Now, as someone who was born long after the 1969 Stonewall Uprising and matured in the wake of the 1995 US peak of the AIDS pandemic, I will fully admit that I enjoy a privilege founded upon past fear, discrimination, death, and acts of hate experienced by people who were like me, and yet, despite these adversities, they were brave enough to fight for my future, my rights. So the way I honor those past individuals is through remembrance, preserving and sharing their stories. I will attempt to do that this evening, but I also hope that this might be a collaborative effort. Our history is incomplete, and I have certainly made edits to this narrative based on factors like the availability of resources, the need for brevity, and my own knowledge and interests. And so I welcome your feedback, and I hope that we may have the opportunity, both tonight and in the future, to collectively piece together a shared understanding of the queer past. Expanding on this metaphor of one's location in history, I can't help but think about my literal physical position of where I live in Orlando's Thornton Park. My home is about almost equal distance between two significant landmarks for Orlando's LGBTQ community. The first is one you are likely familiar with, the rainbow-colored bandshell of Lake Eola Park's amphitheater. Following the 2016 tragedy at Pulse Nightclub, the bandshell's repainting was a tribute to the 49 individuals who lost their lives in what was the deadliest mass shooting in US history. The bandshell was repainted ahead of the 2016 Come Out With Pride, the annual festival in the park that takes place each October. And in the proposal for the bandshell's repainting, the project's designers noted a specific meaning for each color in the rainbow. Red for love, blue for the sadness we collectively felt after Pulse, and to honor the police and first responders. Sorry, I skipped orange. Orange for Orange County, yellow for faith and hope, green for life, its fragility and renewal, blue for the sadness, and purple for valor and bravery. There are many public artworks and memorials throughout Orlando that are dedicated to the Pulse victims. And these sites also act as inclusive gestures, welcoming the LGBTQ community. Though out of all of these tributes, the bandshell, located in our city's beloved park, is perhaps the most recognizable. The second landmark significance to the LGBTQ community is not publicly acknowledged with a placard, display, or artwork. There are certainly no rainbows in Carl T. Langford Park, but it remains an important site in the history of Orlando's gay liberation movement. Beginning in 1987, the Orlando Police Department operated an undercover detail in this park that targeted gay men suspected of cruising for sex. 17 of the men arrested were not charged, actually, with lewd conduct, but rather for violating a previously unenforced city ordinance to remain on designated sidewalks and pathways within a public park. At the time, Orlando Police Captain Dwayne McRae admitted to the Orlando Sentinel that plainclothes officers would arrest suspected homosexuals on whatever charge possible. Several men reported being harassed while walking through the park alone, with the police interrogating them about their sexualities. The arrests were perceived by activists as an attack on the gay community. Local gay rights advocate Michael Wanzi said, quote, "In the city of Orlando, gays and lesbians are not free from targeted harassment. We are not asking for special rights, simply to be treated equally," end quote. The arrests in Langford Park led to Orlando's first public protest for gay rights. On April 23rd, 1988, 80 gay men and women gathered in the park as part of Operation Sharing Love and Affection in the Park, organized by the activist group We the People. They picnicked and listened to speakers, including a victim of the police's harassment. They demanded change and the protection of gay and lesbian rights. It was one way that Orlando's LGBTQ community began to take on a more public, assertive role. So I travel between these locations, these landmarks, these locations that feel like opposite poles in the history of acceptance, of inclusion for Central Florida's queer community. How did we get here? Where are other sites of past prejudice, protests, progress? Who are the leaders who shaped this region's LGBTQ community? One of the activists who helped organize the protest in Langford Park was Savi Shafé, whose scrapbooks are in the museum's collection. These scrapbooks include numerous news clippings and photographs documenting Shafé's involvement in the community. A business owner in Winter Park, he owns the Powerhouse Cafe. Shafé filed for a permit to host a Pride event in the town's Central Park in June of 1988. The permit was denied, but a group of 50 people organized in the park anyway to protest the decision. Their protests drew counter-demonstrators, dressed in Ku Klux Klan regalia. And so right there on Park Avenue, in the heart of Winter Park, queer people and Klan members clashed in an exchange rooted in fear of difference, fear of those who fall outside of the heteronormative cisgender majority. This fear has led many queer individuals to face discrimination, abandonment, and legal challenges. As an example, there are numerous cases of LGBTQ individuals being denied custody of their children on the grounds of their sexuality or gender identities. During a 1979 custody battle, a psychologist employed at Shands Teaching Hospital in Gainesville presented damning testimony against a bisexual woman's claim to her children. He told the court that if custody were awarded to the mother, then her 3 daughters would, quote, undergo gender identification problems, receive social ridicule, be deprived of a needed father figure, and have normal psychological development threatened, end quote. In another 1992 case, a Sanford transgender woman's ex-wife told the Orlando Sentinel, quote, "To me, this is wrong in God's eyes. This is not what you are supposed to do with your body. I do not want my son to think this is normal. This is not the way he should be brought up," end quote. So despite being legally recognized as a woman and the 13-year-old boy's statement to the judge that he wanted to live with both of his mothers, custody was not awarded to the transgender parent. The argument that those who identify as LGBTQ corrupt children persists today, as evidenced by the recent debates over the controversial Parental Rights in Education bill, referred to by opponents as the Don't Say Gay bill. On March 4th, 2022, Governor Ron DeSantis' press secretary, Christina Pushaw, tweeted, quote, "If you're against the anti-grooming bill, you are probably a groomer, or at least you don't denounce the grooming of 4 to 8-year-old children," end quote. Conservative activist and talk radio host Charlie Kirk stated in reference to the bill, quote, "We're talking about gay stuff more than any other time. Why? Because they are not happy just having marriage. Instead, they now want to corrupt your children," end quote. This discourse echoes the language of singer and activist Anita Bryant's 1977 Save Our Children campaign, which led to the repeal of a Dade City ordinance that prohibited discrimination based on sexual orientation. Tying her anti-gay stance to Christian family values, Bryant infamously argued, quote, "The recruitment of our children is absolutely necessary for the survival and growth of homosexuality. For since homosexuals cannot reproduce, they must recruit, they must freshen their ranks," end quote. So in addition to overturning that anti-discrimination ordinance, Bryant's campaign influenced the Florida legislature to pass the country's first law prohibiting adoption by gay men and lesbians. The 1977 law remained in effect until 2010, making our state the last to lift the ban on gay adoptions. Though grooming may be the new term for recruitment of children by gays and lesbians, it is reflective of Save Our Children's dark legacy in the state. Fear has also cost many LGBTQ individuals their careers. The Lavender Scare was a period in US history when gay government employees and contractors faced termination from their positions on the grounds of their sexuality. In 1950, Congress published the report Employment of Homosexuals and Sex Perverts in Government, which concluded that homosexuals are risks to national security. The witch hunt of gays and lesbians occurred at both the national and the state level. It's worth noting that this culture of fear, suspicion, and outing followed the 1948 publication of researcher Alfred Kinsey's Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. The Kinsey report shocked the public with the finding that 37% of the 5,300 interviewed men admitted to at least one homosexual experience. Suddenly, homosexuality was not an abnormality that only occurred within the few, but rather was much more prevalent. Anyone could be gay, and if that were the case, then how might the public go about identifying those men who were light in their loafers? And I know it's a little difficult to make out, but I think this political cartoon really speaks to the cultural impact of the Kinsey report and the fear of the suspicion that was raised. This was published in the New York Times, and you have a woman reading Kinsey's book here, the Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, behind a magazine, gazing out at her husband a bit suspiciously. So rather humorous, but again, speaks to how the Kinsey report came into our culture in a big way. The Florida Legislative Investigation Committee was one such effort to weed out homosexuals. The committee was founded in 1956 and tasked with exploring the allegedly subversive activities of academics, civil rights groups, and suspected communist organizations. Unable to find incriminating offenses committed by civil rights leaders, the committee shifted their focus to identifying and persecuting homosexuals. They used dubious methods, including a network of informants and spies, and the denial of legal counsel during interrogations to entrap teachers, professors, deans, and students at Florida schools and universities. By 1963, the committee's actions resulted in 71 teachers having their teaching certificates revoked, 39 university faculty members removed from their positions, and a suspect list of 123 educators being reported to the Florida Department of Education. The legislature disbanded the committee in 1965, following its publication of the report Homosexuality and Citizenship in Florida, which included graphic photographs and descriptions of sexual relations between men. The legislature quickly stopped printing the report because of the explicit content, but not before a gay book distributor in Washington, D.C. mocked the purple pamphlet, named for the color of the printed report's cover, and reprinted facsimiles as curious incidents of state-sponsored pornography. Perhaps even worse than the pornographic content, which included a disturbing restroom glory hole scene, the committee failed to alphabetize the report's glossary of homosexual terms, a real testament to our legislature's education. Civil rights attorney Harry Kimball similarly faced career ruin for his sexuality, though his story does end in a sense of justice. In 1955, Kimball was arrested at Orlando's Lake Lorna Dune Park on a sodomy charge. He claimed he was falsely charged after he and another man were enticed by an undercover policeman to swim nude. He also later contended that he was targeted by the police for his representation of Black clients. The arrest led to Kimball's disbarment by the Florida Supreme Court for violation of good moral conduct. After a legal battle in which Kimball's lawyers argued that a shift in public opinion on homosexuality had occurred in intervening years, he was permitted to practice law in New York in 1973, and he was eventually readmitted to the Florida bar in 1982. Kimball's arduous readmission to his career field is one success story in the fight to secure equal employment rights for gays and lesbians. Another involves Orange County Sheriff's Department's deputy, Tom Woodard, who was forced in 1989 to resign from duty after being outed as bisexual by another officer. The Sheriff's Department reported on Woodard, who had a spotless record, and the report concluded that the agency, quote, holds that homosexuality is unnatural, immoral, and inexcusable conduct for one of its deputies, end quote. And at the time of his resignation, Woodard was not public about his sexuality, but the incident quickly led him to become what the Orlando Sentinel labeled as a reluctant civil rights fighter. His story was championed by gay rights activists. A rally of 100 people was organized in Orlando with protesters demanding Woodard be reinstated and for a public apology from the sheriff. Regarding his role in advocating for gay rights, Woodard admitted that, quote, "I'm not doing this for the gay community. I'm doing it for myself. I'm definitely not a cause," end quote. In 1992, Woodard successfully won his civil suit against the Sheriff's Department. He was reinstated as a deputy and he was paid back wages. The court, ruling in favor of Woodard, was a powerful message in support of queer rights. Woodard's lawyer, Bill Schaefer, said after the ruling, quote, "I think an employer, particularly a government employer, would think twice about discriminatory behavior against a gay person," end quote. Kimball and Woodard's successful petitions for reemployment reflect a national change in the perception of gays and lesbians that occurred in the latter part of the 20th century. This shift also contributed to the election of Central Florida's first openly gay public official, Commissioner Patty Sheehan. Prior to her election to Orlando's City Council in 2000, Commissioner Sheehan ran an unsuccessful campaign in 1996. In her oral history, she shares an experience from this campaign that is indicative of the othering endured by LGBTQ persons. During a debate at the Audubon Park Covenant Church, the candidates were asked whether they believe those running for political office should make an issue of their sexual orientation. Commissioner Sheehan recalls that an opponent responded with, quote, "Well, I have a wife and I have a child, but I don't think anybody should flaunt their lifestyle," end quote. He went on to win that election. In turn, then candidate Sheehan responded, quote, "Well, it's very interesting because when my opponent talks about his life, it's charming. When I talk about my life, it's flaunting." Commissioner Sheehan went on to defeat the incumbent for her district's council seat 4 years later, and she continues to serve our community in this capacity, advocating, importantly, not only for the rights of the LGBTQ community, but for all minority groups. And as then director of the Gay and Lesbian Center, Chris Manley said of Sheehan's election, quote, "It's important to our community for people to see we can be anything we want to be." While her election certainly is an important testament to queer people's career possibilities, our state's legislature has tried and failed since 2009 to pass a statewide law expanding employment discrimination provisions to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Although protected under federal law, mandated by a US Supreme Court ruling in 2020, for what that's worth these days, workplace protections remain unguaranteed at the state level. One factor that affected the change in public opinion of homosexuality was a nationwide rise in the visibility of queer people following the 1969 Stonewall Uprising in New York City. Prior to the 70s, Central Florida's gay community remained relatively closeted. Gatherings occurred in private homes or at secret locations, and little documentation remains of these activities. Queer people needed places to gather to cultivate community. In 1969, Bill Miller and Michael Hodge opened the Palace Club, a bottle club that operated on Humphreys Avenue, though in its early years, the location was kept secret and relatively secret and shared only by word of mouth. The Palace Club became known for its late-night BYOB after-hours parties and was a space of queer fantasy. Before the Parliament House opened in 1975, the Palace Club was the first location in Orlando to welcome female impersonators. It is where the iconic Miss P, also known as Paul Wegman, began a career as a female impersonator. In an interview for Watermark, Wegman recalled walking into the Palace Club for the first time as a lost, aspiring actor and encountering a queen named Miss Honey performing Spanish Rose from the musical Bye Bye Birdie. Wegman, a Broadway lover, mouthed the words to the song, and in that moment, he knew he was destined to perform in drag. Miss P began appearing at the Palace Club a month later. She eventually graduated from the Palace Club to Miller and Hodges Parliament House, where she served as the MC of the Footlight Theater until her passing in 2004. In an oral history, Wegman described Parliament House's bold impact upon the Orlando gay community when it opened in 1975. The original Motor Inn was established in 1962, but the business suffered after the opening of Walt Disney World in 1971, which diverted tourists to Lake Buena Vista. Miller and Hodge purchased Parliament House for $650,000, which is about $3.5 million today. They reopened as the Parliament House Resort, and they marketed the location specifically to gay audiences. In addition to the 120 guest rooms, the complex featured gay-owned businesses, including a unisex barber, a florist, and a clothing boutique. There was also the dance floor and bar, and of course, the Footlight Theater. Wegman was given carte blanche in the theater. The space opened with a lavish drag version of the musical A Chorus Line. The original had premiered off-Broadway that year, and to much fanfare. Wegman would go on to produce numerous elaborate pastiche performances that dazzled audiences and affirmed Parliament House's reputation as a premier destination dedicated to the art of female impersonation. Now, as the Parliament House grew as an entertainment center with performances that crossed gender boundaries, cross-dressing remained illegal in public, leaving transgender individuals open to a criminal charge for expressing their gender identity. In 1979, Robert Lee Morgan was arrested for violating the city's 1948 ordinance against cross-dressing. And the case reaffirmed the public's negative opinion of transgender individuals. As reported in the Orlando Sentinel, the case was argued in a courtroom where the defendant's pronouns were viciously interchanged by the prosecutor as onlookers snickered. Halfway through the trial, Morgan's attorney had his client change into a woman's wig and clothes before arguing, quote, "What is male dress? What is female dress? At this moment, she is breaking the law of the city of Orlando. Is anyone being hurt? Is anyone passing out? And yet she is being prosecuted as a criminal," end quote. The argument did not convince the jury. Morgan was convicted of the misdemeanor. The city council overturned the cross-dressing ordinance in 1982. It's important to note that Morgan was Black and that Black transgender women continue to disproportionately endure discrimination, hate crimes, and murder. On July 19, 2018, nearly 40 years after Morgan's conviction, Sasha Garden was found dead, her body with signs of trauma, at an apartment complex off Holden Avenue near Orange Blossom Trail. A 27-year-old transgender woman, Garden was remembered by her friends and family as genuine and caring. When law enforcement arrived at the home of Garden's roommate to ask her to identify the body, the officers were condescending. They used the term transvestite to describe her and continued, despite her roommate's repeated corrections, to refer to Garden as a man and use her dead name. Following the precedent set by the sheriff's office, their media release, local television stations used headlines that described Garden not as a trans woman, but as a, quote, man wearing a wig and dressed as a woman. The sheriff's office eventually issued an apology for their insensitivity. At a vigil for Garden, her friends told the Orlando Weekly that they remained hurt by law enforcement and the media's portrayal of Garden, and that this is indicative of the continued discrimination endured by transgender people. Now, turning to Parliament House, in addition to serving as an important venue for challenging perceptions of gender normativity, the Parliament House's significance within the gay and lesbian community grew throughout the AIDS pandemic. Though the term AIDS, which stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, had not yet been coined by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the agency released data about patients diagnosed with the disease in 1982. Florida reported 32 cases that year, with one man living in Orlando until he was brought to Washington, D.C. for an experimental treatment offered by the National Institute of Health. By the next year, the number of cases in the state grew by 566%, and the exponential growth continued through the peak of new infections in 1993 and deaths in 1995. As the pandemic worsened in Central Florida and across the nation, Miller and Hodge used their influence as the Parliament House's owners to help raise money to support locals living with the disease. Parliament House also served as a space of collective gathering and mourning for those lost to AIDS. The legacy of the Parliament House resort outlived its owners. Miller passed away from AIDS-related complications in 1987, followed by Hodge in 1992. In November 2020, Parliament House permanently closed at its location on Orange Blossom Trail, and despite reports of a new location in downtown Orlando, the nightclub has yet to reopen. Parliament House's closing is indicative of a recent national decline in the popularity of businesses that specifically serve gay and lesbian consumers. Establishments dedicated to the queer community are increasingly endangered, especially gay bars and nightclubs. At best, this is caused by cultural obsolescence. Younger generations may not see the need for businesses dedicated to gays and lesbians. They might actually feel included in straight spaces. What a novel idea. But of course, Central Floridians who lived through the Pulse tragedy know all too well that at worst, these spaces may be targets of violent attacks. Though the most fatal attack upon our community, Pulse is actually not the Central Florida's only queer space to experience a destructive act. In January 1979, just a few months after having reopened as a gay establishment, the Grand Central Hotel caught fire. Formerly the San Juan Hotel, the Grand Central featured a disco in the basement that featured top-notch performers like Donna Summer, Earth, Wind & Fire, Grace Jones, Gloria Gaynor, Thelma Houston, and Wayne Newton. The hotel, which was located on Orange Avenue downtown, was controversial within the conservative Orlando community. A local pastor of a major Baptist church once left for the new owner a pair of roller skates at the hotel's reservation counter with an attached note that read, quote, "Let these expedite your way to hell, Ken Berry, pray," end quote. The fire was ruled as an arson, though the crime was never solved. Although Orlando Sentinel's coverage of the fire cast suspicion on the owner, claiming he owed back taxes on the building and implying he may benefit from the insurance payout, Bray's stepson wrote in a 2018 editorial published in the Sentinel that, quote, "Burning down the building my stepfather loved was the last thing he would do. as he thought of it as a safe haven for the gay community and their friends, not only to have fun, but to feel normal. Unquote. There were other suspects for the fire, including several religious zealots who expressed their view that the burning symbolized the establishment and its patrons burning in hell. While gay bars, nightclubs, and other entertainment venues are certainly important sites for queer community building, there are many other significant types of businesses, nonprofit organizations, and associations that serve the Central Florida LGBTQ community. As a 1983 editorial in the LGBTQ publication New Direction argued, quote, while bars and taverns have long played an important part in gay life, many persons would rather see the political and social efforts towards the community come from a non-bar direction, unquote. In the last 30 years of the 20th century, several community organizing establishments and associations welcoming of LGBTQ persons developed outside of the bar scene. The Gay Student Union at Florida Technological University, now UCF, formed in 1976. Joy Metropolitan Community Church's first service was offered in 1979. Orange Blossom Bowling League, a league for gays and lesbians, began in 1985. Hope and Help, an organization dedicated to caring for those living with HIV and AIDS, opened in '88. And Orlando Gay Chorus was founded in 1990, and Out and About Books, our first queer bookstore, opened in 1992. The list goes on. And each of these organizations is deserving of their own lecture and their own exhibition. For brevity's sake, one of the most significant organizations and that developed during this period was Gay Social Services, now known as the LGBT Plus Center. GSS began operating in 1978 and opened its first location on West Colonial Drive 6 years later. One of the organization's first services was operating a hotline number, which the number was 407 The Gays, that people could call for support information during the coming out process, including information about gay and lesbian support groups and referrals to mental health counselors. The center, which is now located on North Mills Avenue, continues to serve our community by offering a wide range of services, including HIV and STDI testing, meeting space for a range of support groups, a pantry for those experiencing food insecurity, career planning, immigration resources, and much more. This is also where our museum has its exhibition space, so please go and see the LGBTQ museum's, history museum's small display cases that we have at the center. After Pulse, President Obama referred to the center as ground zero for community healing. The center was not always perceived, though, as welcoming to all who identify as LGBTQ. In its early years, lesbian women were especially critical of the center for favoring gay men. Commissioner Sheehan recalled in her oral history that the lesbian and gay community was very divided through the 1980s, until the women increasingly began to care for the men living with HIV. That gender divide led to the establishment of the Loving Committed Network, a queer women's social group that did not have a governing structure nor definitive meeting location. Between 1984 and 1994, this group met monthly at members' homes. Often, LCN meetings did not have a set agenda. Members might only socialize, play games, or discuss civic causes. The group also published a monthly newsletter, LCN Express, that now serves as an important record documenting the interests of a women's group in a pre-digital era. The schism between the women of LCN and the men of the center became a topic that played out through a series of letters published in the LCN Express and the center's newsletter. Writing in response to a letter written by Sheehan, Michael Wanzi concluded in an open letter published in the January 1988 edition of the LCN Express. And just to note that Wanzi was the first man to be able to submit and be published in the LCN Express. He wrote that, quote, "Our community is one of diverse peoples. We may never all agree on everything, but there is one thing upon which I pray we can agree. Let's agree to work together instead of against one another. There are too many outside forces working against us as gay and lesbian Americans. Let us leave no room for oppression from within." Wansi's letter underscores the power in unifying minority groups, which is a justification for the expansive acronym LGBTQIAAP: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, allies, and pansexual. While we may not always have the same interests, and certainly events continue to cater to specific segments of the LGBTQ community, organizing together allows for greater visibility for those causes that we do share. One way that lesbian women, gay men, bisexual, and later transgender people organized to raise visibility and social awareness was through rallies, demonstrations, and takeovers of straight spaces. National examples of this include the 6 marches on Washington that have occurred between 1979 and 2017, each advocating for equal civil rights for the LGBTQ community, and the pride parades and celebrations that have developed in cities across the US, often tied in June, of course, to the anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. Central Florida's first pride parade, pride picnic, occurred in June 1981 in Turkey Lake Park. It was not covered in the Sentinel until 1983, when 350 people gathered for the 3rd annual event. Though meant as a statement of one's pride in belonging or supporting the LGBTQ community, many of the individuals interviewed by the Sentinel in 1983 were weary of using their last names. One man said he would lie and say he was with his brother, not his lover, if his boss were to catch him at the picnic. Another joked that despite his community apprehension of stepping out of the closet, gays are everywhere in Central Florida. The Orlando Regional Pride Parade began in June 1991, eventually drawing thousands to Lake Eola Park. And of course, in 2005, the parade was reorganized as Come Out with Pride, and it was moved to October, which corresponds with National Coming Out Day. Other ways in which the community has organized en masse include gay skate nights, first organized by the Center in 1979, a gay day at the Central Florida Fair in 1991, and also in 91, the first gay day at Walt Disney World, the annual tradition of wearing a red shirt at Disney that now draws over 100,000 people to our area on the first Saturday in June. The Disney event has been particularly disruptive and controversial. Though it is not officially recognized by Disney, this event was lambasted through the years by conservative Christian and family organizations. The Westboro Baptist Church began a boycott of Disney in 1995, in part because of Gay Day, later Gay Days, and televangelist Jerry Falwell Sr. described the event in 1999 as, quote, red-faced parents were confronted with throngs of in-your-face homosexual behavior at nearly every turn, end quote. Until 1995, Disney employees posted signs at the park's front entrance that warned guests that they will encounter homosexuals who have chosen to visit the park on that day. Doug Swallow, the event's original organizer, contended that the purpose of the first gay day was to be counted, again, reflecting the strength of unity in numbers. And that, of course, I think unity is how the LGBTQ community has successfully lobbied for many rights at national and local levels, including gay marriage, adoption, and anti-discrimination legislation, all of which, again, are deserving of their own lecture or expansive episodes. But where does all of this leave us? Where does all of this history leave us? Beginning with the Stonewall Uprising in 1969, our community has emerged to become a powerful, united political group. Though, as Benjamin cautions, this historical narrative should not be considered a pure testament to progress. Certainly, our rights continue to be threatened. Queer spaces and bodies remain under attack and risk erasure. There remains a disparity in the rights afforded to certain members of our LGBTQ community. So reflecting on all of these stories, I return to my opening question: what metaphoric image, pattern, constellation might we divine from this history of our LGBTQ community? And reflecting on the sways that have occurred in our gay liberation movement, I envision a pendulum, though not one like this, whose movement goes back and forth between 2 points, two polarized political perspectives. Instead, the pendulum that comes to mind is the one used by French physicist Léon Foucault in his 1851 experiment that definitively proved the Earth's rotation. In this experiment, Foucault suspended a heavy pendulum from the ceiling of the Pantheon in Paris. As the Earth rotated beneath the free-moving pendulum, it traced not a linear path back and forth, but one that is curved. Take a look at that shape that's being created in this video. The pendulum continued to revolve, and the time it took to complete a full revolution and return to its starting point was dependent on the latitude at which it was set. To me, this curving, this winding path traced by the pendulum's movement is a fitting metaphor for our gay liberation movement. We do not move point to point between locations like Langford Park and Lake Eola Bandshell. Our path is rather winding. And like the Earth's rotation, there are forces outside of our control as a community that may profoundly affect our direction in the fight for equality. Despite this, we continue to bob, to trace petal-like curved shapes below. And as we move, as our resilience propels us to change our society, we may create something beautiful, like the flower shape that is cast by the movement of Foucault's pendulum. A queer utopia that is yet to be realized. Thank you so much for listening this evening. So I'm happy to take some questions if you have any.
We'd love to have you speak to the ruling that just came out on Friday and how you feel like it might, just in case you have that on your mind.
I mean, it's definitely on my mind. I think that I'm very afraid of the overturning of the 2003 Orange v. Texas ruling in relation to LGBTQ rights and sovereignty rights. I think that ruling, which is grounded in similar precedent, it runs the risk of having that happen. And I'm not as alarmist when it comes to the idea of gay marriage being overturned, but of course, I can see that as well in some ways. But really, Lawrence v. Texas is the one that I would be worried about. And of course, I'm terrified. So, other questions? Thoughts? Well, I really appreciate you listening.
I kind of have a question. I'm trying to process through. So I'm like when I saw the picture of the Klan in the not so distant past, it's horrifying to me. That was right sort of when I moved to Orlando, and I did feel a culture shock. I grew up in Miami, and like I felt that there was sort of that element still around. As a city, is Orlando unique, or in that I always feel like we have become a progressive community? I do. Maybe I'm naive in that. And how do we compare to some other cities,
So comparing Orlando, you can all hear the question was about comparing Orlando to other cities and inclusivity and the shock.
Especially like I know in the north,
Yeah.
maybe they didn't deal with that southern culture quite as much as it's still seeped into some stuff in the south.
Sure. So I will say the HRC has awarded us a perfect 100 as a score for, I'm not gonna get this, on their equality index as a city. So they award that based on anti-discrimination laws in place, inclusive measures. There's a whole ranking system which you can find online, that report card. So that to me speaks to, of course, our city's truly inclusive nature. We repeatedly rank and polling as an inclusive city for LGBTQ people. I think that Pulse changed a lot of things. And I worry sometimes, though, like a pendulum, and the way things do swing and the way things do curve, that while Pulse really pushed us off course in an incredible way, and pushed us towards maybe a more inclusive environment, if there will not be some sort of push back or forgetting. Memory, of course, is so short. And so I'm not sure. I mean, rah, rah, rainbows, I think it's great that we have all of these beautiful testaments and welcoming gestures in Orlando. But I still worry about that and what the future might look like for queer individuals. We live in a state that has been very apprehensive along the way for supporting LGBTQ people. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of that. My friends and I all talk about it, Orlando as a bubble. You drive 20 minutes outside of Orlando and it's a very different environment. So I don't know if that answers your question, and that's really just my own opinion, but and I think all of us probably have thoughts on it, but maybe that's a good place to end and to just discuss among ourselves. Yeah?
I heard you talk about Michael Wanty. I've heard that name before.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more about him?
Yeah, and I really wanted to include this story, and I pulled it at the end of the but it's a long lecture. Sorry, thanks for staying with me. There's a great story of Michael Wanty. Wanty is an advocate, a playwright, is just so many different things to the Orlando community. And in the 80s, there's a really heartbreaking story of he lost his 23-year-old, somewhere 23, lover to AIDS. And there's a letter that Wanty wrote describing that experience that's in the center, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And so he is as a playwright, he's used that autobiography to really inform some of the works that he's done and put on at Fringe, and they're always really powerful pieces. So I highly recommend checking him out. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Well, thank you again for sticking with me, and I hope we can piece together a history. And I hope that you'll get involved with our LGBTQ History Museum. So, thank you.